This diagram illustrates the standard response to a life-threatening trauma. When the brain detects a threat, say a predator or a sudden physical attack, it triggers a state of hypervigilance. The biological objective is clear: lock onto the danger and avoid it at all costs. The pathway diverges when the threat originates from a caregiver, the person required for survival. In these cases, the drive to maintain attachment overrides the threat detection system, leading to profound amnesia or total blindness to the abuse. Labeling this a cognitive deficit or a failure of intelligence ignores the biological reality. High-functioning individuals are often the most adept at rationalizing these inconsistencies. The brain utilizes a dual-process neurobiological strategy to sequester awareness, prioritizing the preservation of life-sustaining bonds over the recognition of harm. To understand how the mind executes this, we have to look under the hood. We will trace the exact limbic neurobiology that suppresses threat detection, leading to the complex identity distortions seen in adult survivors. Mapping this architecture shifts our understanding of trauma. These memory gaps are a brutal, successful survival mechanism. Humans are an intensely altricial species. We experience a remarkably prolonged period of infancy and childhood, where we are entirely dependent on adults for our basic biological needs. If a child's brain were to execute a standard fight-or-flight withdrawal response away from an abusive caregiver, the physiological result is disastrous. They would immediately lose access to food, shelter, and physical protection. This creates an impossible scenario, known in clinical psychology as the heart bind. The organism's primary source of survival is simultaneously its source of harm. The nervous system is forced to prioritize between two conflicting evolutionary drives: the instinct to detect danger and the absolute necessity to maintain attachment. Because severing the bond risks death in an evolutionary context, the brain actively suppresses its own threat detection awareness to solve the crisis. Not knowing about the abuse allows the child to continue behaving normally. This compliant behavior inspires parental attachment, successfully securing the caregiving resources required to stay alive. In a state of absolute dependency, the brain chooses a functional lie over a lethal truth, ensuring survival through epistemic blindness. This schematic highlights the three neural zones involved in processing reality: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. Normally, the amygdala acts as the brain's alarm bell, detecting threats and sending alert signals upward. When a trusted figure violates that trust, the amygdala spikes into severe hyperarousal. But because the threat is a needed caregiver, a functional block prevents that alarm from reaching the conscious brain. To protect the relationship, the attachment system actively inhibits the prefrontal cortex. With the prefrontal cortex compromised, higher-order thinking shuts down. The victim loses the executive capacity to connect the dots between the abuser's disparate actions and their own suffering. Instead, the remaining frontal capacity is recruited for executive rationalization. The brain works overtime to invent complex, plausible excuses for the perpetrator's red flags, effectively neutralizing the cognitive dissonance. Meanwhile, the physical body absorbs the impact. Sustained betrayal triggers a chronic release of stress hormones. Here, cortisol floods the region around the hippocampus. At high, sustained levels, cortisol is neurotoxic. It physically damages the hippocampus, severely limiting the brain's ability to encode long-term memories. This damage destroys the spatio-temporal organization of the traumatic event. The linear timeline of what happened and when shatters. The abuse is stored out of conscious reach as isolated sensory nodes: a flash of a visual, a specific smell, or an unexplained somatic pain, stripped of narrative context. At a cellular level, the brain actively sacrifices a coherent perception of reality in order to maintain a functional interface with the abuser. This biological fragmentation translates into a psychological architecture known as structural dissociation. The unified self divides into distinct operating states. The apparently normal part handles daily functioning. Its job is to maintain a solid, compliant connection with the perpetrator, shielded from the trauma. The emotional part acts as a vault. It holds the sequestered fear, the physical pain, and the disjointed traumatic memories. ensuring that erratic data never crosses over to disrupt daily life. We see this architecture in cases of intrafamilial child sexual abuse. The child faces a breach of the social contract, where the protector becomes the predator. Victims routinely develop psychogenic amnesia. This occurs as a failure of the awareness system to integrate the experience into the autobiographical self. To cope, the child splits the abuser's identity, aggressively defending a positive introject. They compartmentalize the abuse to preserve the illusion that they have a safe parent. Protecting the image of the abuser requires the victim to constrict their own personality. The authentic self is hollowed out to make room for the lie. A child will fracture their own personality to prevent breaking the bond that keeps them alive. This childhood survival architecture persists long after the dependency ends. The automatic habits of numbing, splitting, and ignoring relational danger become the baseline for adult life, manifesting as the identity and trust distortions of complex PTSD. This graph maps the Trust Calibration Paradox, the core relational symptom of complex PTSD. We measure the amygdala's threat sensitivity against how close an individual is to their attachment figure. Here is the first extreme, false suspicion. Notice the severe threat sensitivity toward distant stimuli. A sensitized amygdala misfires constantly. The survivor reads profound danger into benign environmental cues, like a delayed text message or a shift in a coworker's tone. But look at the opposite extreme, actual blindness. When the stimulus involves a primary attachment, threat detection plummets to zero. The attachment system overrides explicit reality. A highly intelligent adult will ignore glaring financial discrepancies or explicit digital evidence of a spouse's infidelity. The nervous system physically rations awareness because acknowledging the truth would mean the collapse of their housing, finances, and identity. The body absorbs the danger the mind refuses to name, resulting in chronic fatigue and intense somatic pain. Complex PTSD creates a devastating epistemic prison. The brain is forced to anticipate danger from everywhere in the world, except from the exact place it actually exists. There is a persistent cultural and forensic narrative suggesting that children who suffer severe maltreatment inevitably mature into abusers themselves. This data table tracks the actual clinical outcomes of childhood victimization. The numbers show a clear reality. 90% of boys who endure sexual abuse do not go on to offend. While severe trauma does elevate the baseline risk compared to the general population, the vast majority of victims either engage in a painful healing process or suffer re-victimization. They do not become perpetrators. In the rare instances where a survivor does transition to perpetration, specific maladaptive pathways are at work. The first is repetition compulsion, an unconscious drive to reenact the trauma in a desperate attempt to gain mastery over the original event. Another is identification with the aggressor. The individual adopts the behaviors and perspective of their abuser as a psychological defense, seeking to reclaim power and ensure they are never the vulnerable victim again. Unresolved trauma and systemic isolation are undeniable risk factors, but the statistical rule of betrayal trauma is profound resilience. The clinical data strictly decouples victimization from destiny. If the blindness is structural, what happens when an adult survivor attempts to dismantle it and integrate the truth? Sudden awareness is incredibly dangerous. The individual's entire psychological identity rests on this cognitive sequestration. When a lifelong illusion falls too quickly, it triggers severe physiological shock. Survivors experience acute panic, sleeplessness, and total identity diffusion as the internal scaffolding collapses. This informs the foundational mandate of trauma-informed care. Therapists must prioritize physical safety and somatic regulation long before attempting memory retrieval or confronting the narrative. This diagram illustrates the slow, paced process of cognitive integration. The sequestered emotional data from the trauma vault is carefully relinked back into the executive brain's daily functioning. The nervous system requires time to quietly build the bandwidth necessary to withstand the loss of the illusion, process the grief, and eventually restore epistemic trust in reality. Survivors of betrayal trauma carried a brilliant adaptation into adulthood. Recovery is the process of recognizing that the blindness which once ensured their survival is no longer necessary.